Hyperthyroidism, thyrotoxicosis. The term thyrotoxicosis is retained because hyperthyroidism, i.e. symptoms due to a raised level of circulating thyroid hormones, is not responsible for all manifestations of the disease. Clinical types are filled circle diffuse toxic goiter, Graves' disease, filled circle toxic nodular goiter, filled circle toxic nodule, filled circle hyperthyroidism due to rarer causes. Diffuse toxic goiter, Graves' disease, a diffuse vascular goiter appearing at the same time as hyperthyroidism, usually occurs in younger women and is frequently associated with eye signs, figure 55.17. The syndrome is that of primary thyrotoxicosis. 55% of patients have a family history of autoimmune endocrine diseases. The whole of the functioning thyroid tissue is involved, and the hypertrophy and hyperplasia are due to abnormal TSH rub that bind to TSH receptor sites and produce a disproportionate and prolonged effect. Toxic nodular goiter. A simple nodular goiter is present for a long time before the hyperthyroidism, usually in the middle-aged or elderly, and very infrequently is associated with eye signs. The syndrome is that of secondary thyrotoxicosis. In many cases of toxic nodular goiter, the nodules are inactive, and it is the internodular thyroid tissue that is overactive. However, in some toxic nodular goiters, one or more nodules are overactive, and here the hyperthyroidism is due to autonomous thyroid tissue, as in a toxic adenoma. Toxic nodule is a solitary overactive nodule, which may be part of a generalized nodularity or a true toxic adenoma. Autonomous in its hypertrophy and hyperplasia are not due to TSH rub. TSH secretion is suppressed by the high level of circulating thyroid hormones, and the normal thyroid tissue surrounding the nodule is itself suppressed and inactive. Histology. The normal thyroid gland consists of acini lined with fat and cuboidal epithelium and filled with homogeneous colloid, figure 55.2. In hyperthyroidism, figure 55.18, there is hyperplasia of acini, which are lined by high columnar epithelium. Many of them are empty, and others contain vacuolated colloid with a characteristic, scalloped, pattern adjacent to the thyrocytes. Principles of treatment of thyrotoxicosis. Non-specific measures are rest and sedation, and in established thyrotoxicosis should be used only in conjunction with specific measures, i.e. the use of antithyroid drugs, surgery and radioiodine. Antithyroid drugs. Those in common use are carbimazole and propylthiouracil. Antithyroid drugs are used to restore the patient to a euthyroid. Stay tuned to maintain this for a prolonged period in the hope that a permanent remission will occur, i.e. that production of TSH rub will diminish or cease. Antithyroid drugs cannot cure a toxic nodule. The overactive thyroid tissue is autonomous, and recurrence of the hyperthyroidism is certain when the drug is discontinued. Filled circle advantages. No surgery and no use of radioactive materials. Filled circle disadvantages. Treatment is prolonged and the failure rate is at least 55%. The duration of treatment may be tailored to the severity of the toxicity, with milder cases being treated for only 6 months and severe cases for 2 years before stopping therapy. Surgery in diffuse toxic goiter and toxic nodular goiter with overactive internodular tissue. Surgery cures by reducing the mass of overactive tissue by reducing the thyroid below a critical mass. After subtotal thyroidectomy, the patient should return to a euthyroid state, albeit after a variable period of hypothyroidism. There are, however, long-term risks of recurrence and eventual thyroid failure. In contrast, total, near-total thyroidectomy accepts immediate thyroid failure and lifelong thyroxine replacement to eliminate the risk of recurrence and simplify follow-up. Operation may result in a reduction in TSH rub. In the autonomous toxic nodule, and in toxic nodular goiter with overactive autonomous toxic nodules, surgery cures by removing all the overactive thyroid tissue. This allows the suppressed normal tissue to function again. Filled circle advantages. The goiter is removed. The cure is rapid and the cure rate is high if surgery has been adequate. Filled circle disadvantages. Recurrence of thyrotoxicosis occurs in at least 5% of cases when subtotal thyroidectomy is carried out. There is a risk of permanent hypoparathyroidism and nerve injury. Young women tend to have a poorer cosmetic result from the scar. Every operation carries a risk, but with suitable preparation and an experienced surgeon, the mortality is negligible and the morbidity low. Radioiodine. Radioiodine destroys thyroid cells and, as in thyroidectomy, reduces the mass of functioning thyroid tissue to below a critical level. Filled circle advantages. No surgery and no prolonged drug therapy. Filled circle disadvantages. Isotope facilities must be available. The patient must be quarantined while radiation levels are high and avoid pregnancy in close physical contact, particularly with children. Eye signs may be aggravated. Choice of therapy. Each case must be considered individually. Below are listed guiding principles on the most satisfactory treatment for a particular toxic goiter at a particular age. These must, however, be modified according to the facilities available and the personality and wishes of the individual patient and any other coexistent medical or surgical condition. Access to post-treatment care and availability of replacement thyroxine can be important considerations in some areas. Diffuse toxic goiter. Most patients have an initial course of antithyroid drugs with radioiodine for relapse. Exceptions are those who refuse radiation, those who have large goiters or progressive eye signs, and those who are pregnant. Toxic nodular goiter. Toxic nodular goiter is often large and uncomfortable and enlarges still further with antithyroid drugs. Large goiters should be treated surgically because they do not respond as well or as rapidly to radioiodine or antithyroid drugs as does a diffuse toxic goiter. Toxic nodule surgery or radioiodine treatment is appropriate. Resection is easy, certain, and has limited morbidity. Radioiodine is a good alternative for patients over the age of 45 years because the suppressed thyroid tissue does not take up iodine and thus there is minimal risk of delayed thyroid insufficiency. Failure of previous treatment with antithyroid drugs or radioiodine, in this case, surgery or thyroid ablation with 123. I is appropriate. Surgery for thyrotoxicosis. Preoperative preparation. Traditional preparation aims to make the patient biochemically euthyroid at operation. Preparation is as an outpatient and only rarely is admission to hospital necessary on account of severe symptoms at presentation, failure to control the hypothyroidism or non-compliance with medication. Care should be coordinated with endocrinology input. Carbimazole 30 to 40 mg per day is the drug of choice for preparation. When euthyroid, after 8 to 12 weeks, the dose may be reduced to 5 mg 8 hourly or a block and replace regime used. In this case, the high dose of carbimazole is continued to inhibit T3 and T4 production and a maintenance dose of 0.1–0.15 mg thyroxine is given daily. The last dose of carbimazole may be given on the evening before surgery. Iodides are not used alone because, if the patient needs preoperative treatment, a more effective drug should be given. An alternative method of preparation is to abolish the clinical manifestations of the toxic state, using beta-adrenergic blocking drugs. These act on the target organs and not on the gland itself. Propranolol also inhibits the peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. The appropriate dosages are propranolol 40 mg 3 times daily. Clinical response to beta blockade is rapid and the patient may be rendered clinically euthyroid and operation arranged in a few days rather than weeks. The dose of beta-adrenergic blocking drug is increased to achieve the required clinical response, and quite often larger doses, propranolol 80 mg 3 times daily or nadolol 320 mg once daily, are necessary. Beta-adrenergic blocking drugs do not interfere with synthesis of thyroid hormones, and hormone levels remain high during treatment and for some days after thyroidectomy. It is, therefore, important to continue treatment for 7 days postoperatively. Iodine may be given with carbimazole or a beta-adrenergic blocking drug for 10 days before operation. Iodide alone produces a transient remission and may reduce vascularity, thereby marginally improving safety. The use of iodine preparations is not universal because of more effective alternatives. Iodine gives an additional measure of safety in case the early morning dose of beta-adrenergic blocking drug is mistakenly omitted on the day of operation. The extent of the resection depends on the size of the gland, the age of the patient, the experience of the surgeon, the need to minimize the risk of recurrent toxicity and the wish to avoid postoperative thyroid replacement. Table 55.5. Surgical technique of thyroidectomy. The aim of thyroidectomy is to remove the entire thyroid lobe, bilaterally if total thyroidectomy, encompassing all disease and preserving the cervical strap muscles, external branches of the superior laryngeal nerve, the RLN, parathyroid glands and their blood supply in each case while minimizing cosmetic impact. Setup. With the patient under general anesthesia, supine, arms at their side, with their head on a ring and neck extended with a shoulder roll or the head of the table extended with the head of the bed raised. Reverse Trendelenburg. The operative felt is prepared from lower lip to upper chest. A nerve monitor endotracheal tube or electrode wrap can be used. See new technology in thyroidectomy. The position of the tube should be checked after positioning the patient is extending the neck and withdraw the tube and compromise the contact of the electrodes in the larynx. Either use a head drape or square off the surgical site. If head draping, include the nerve monitor leads in the head drape. Alternatively, squaring of the surgical site can give easier access to the endotracheal tube if required. Exposure. The skin incision is placed in a skin crease as close as possible to the cricoid at the superior edge of the thyroid isthmus, which is usually palpable. The length of the incision is determined by the size of the thyroid. However, there is little benefit in extending the incision much beyond the medial edge of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Mark the incision before prepping and infiltrate with local anesthetic and adrenaline, epinephrine. A scalpel is used for the skin incision. Incise through the dermis, making sure to use the full extent of the incision. Monopolar diathermy can be used to expose and divide the platysma. This plane is then used to raise a subplatysmal flap to the thyroid notch of the thyroid cartilage superiorly and to the suprasternal notch inferiorly. The midline is identified between the strap muscles superiorly as, often, the sternocleidomastoid muscles separate around the thyroid eminence. The sternocleidomastoid muscles are raised with toothed forceps and monopolar diathermy is used to divide the fascia, avoiding injury to the anterior jugular veins. A Langenbeck retractor helps dissect superior and inferior limits. The plane is developed to dissect between the muscle layers, elevating sternocleidomastoid laterally until the ansa cervicalis is visualized. The sternothyroid muscle is then mobilized from the gland, taking great care with the delicate vasculature. If required, the strap muscles may be divided superiorly to afford greater exposure. There is usually an artery and a vein traveling between the two strap muscles superilaterally. These can be injured if overly enthusiastic blunt dissection is used. Once the internal jugular vein is identified, dissection medial and deep to this will allow identification of the common carotid artery, and between the vessels the vagus nerve. This should be stimulated to prove that the nerve monitor is functioning properly. If the latency reading on the nerve monitor is unexpectedly short on the right side, then consider a non-recurrent right laryngeal nerve. At this point the gland is exposed and ready for dissection. Minimal blood loss should have been encountered. Upper pole. The assistant now places Langenbeck retractors under sternocleidomastoid, one lateral to the upper pole and one medial. This displays the superior thyroid vascular pedicle, which is controlled with ties or a bipolar energy device. This not only mobilizes the superior pole but also preserves the blood supply to the superior parathyroid gland. In addition, it minimizes risk to the superior laryngeal nerve, which can often be seen passing medially towards the cricothyroid muscle. Gradually the superior pole is mobilized, taking care not to dissect below the cricoid cartilage, at which point the RLN is at risk, figure 55.19. Mobilizing the rest of the gland. Gentle traction on the fascia over the gland, immediately next to the superior plane, will show a plane to follow over the main thyroid. This is followed inferiorly, avoiding excessive lateral dissection to prevent inadvertent damage to the RLN. Blunt dissection will allow much of this fascia to be mobilized. Occasional vessels require bipolar cautery. Next, the trachea is identified in the midline below the isthmus, staying on the cartilage and close to the gland in order to prevent damage to vessels that may contribute to arcades supplying the inferior parathyroid gland. At this point, the RLN is superior and lateral to the trachea and inferior to the plane developed superiorly. Depending on just how compliant the fascia is and how large the lobe is, much of the dissection may now be complete. A pledget may be used to brush fascia laterally. Identification of the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It is not uncommon that the RLN can be seen at this point. Assuming it is not, dissection proceeds by gently mobilizing the fascia around the gland, staying directly on the gland and not dividing anything that could be neural. The RLN will be close, often but not always behind the inferior thyroid artery, approximately 70%. By remaining vigilant, never dividing any structure that could remotely be neural and slowly dissecting fascia, the lobe can be delivered from above and below, mobilizing in the direction of Berry's ligament. Using this approach, the RLN will be identified and can be confirmed with the nerve stimulator. Once the nerve has been identified, a number of approaches are possible. Ideally, the nerve is largely lateral to the gland. This allows dissection to progress until only Berry's ligament remains. However, if the nerve lies medially, it may actually lie on the thyroid and require gentle dissection to free it from the thyroid surface. If this is the case, stay directly on the nerve and slowly dissect the nerve free of the surrounding tissue, endeavoring not to injure the nerve by direct pressure. The nerve should be traced towards the cricothyroid joint. As it enters the larynx, the pretracheal fascia condenses into Berry's ligament at this point. Small vessels within the ligament retract if not controlled with bipolar cautery or ties, and the resulting bleeding can disorientate the surgeon, placing the nerve at risk. In order to avoid this, preemptive diathermy to the ligament and careful layer-by-layer dissection allows final mobilization of the thyroid lobe. Some surgeons prefer to isolate the ligament and apply a careful tie to achieve hemostasis. Whichever method is preferred, great care must be taken at this point. Management of Berry's ligament. The exact anatomy here will depend on how extensive the condensation of fascia, Berry's ligament, is and how it relates to the RLN. This is variable, and this relationship dictates how easy the next steps are. In some, the ligament is distant from the nerve. In others, the nerve runs up to and even through the ligament. Keeping the nerve in direct vision, minimal division of the ligament allows the RLN to move back and expose more of the ligament, allowing the process to continue, layer by layer, until the nerve is well lateral and the ligament has been divided. If, during this process, bleeding is encountered, the use of targeted pressure and occasionally FNE tip suction to identify the specific bleeding point and careful use of bipolar cautery will achieve hemostasis. This must be meticulous, as re-exploration of this area for bleeding puts the RLN at significant risk. Delivery of the gland. Loose pretrachea fascia can now be opened with monopolar diathermy over the trachea to the midline and beyond to remove the isthmus, which is divided, encompassing any pyramidal lobe tissue. The residual isthmus is either oversewn or sealed with bipolar cautery. If a total thyroidectomy is required, the procedure is repeated on the other side. Closure. The operative felt should be inspected. Irrigation with saline helps identification of small bleeding points. The anatomy should be confirmed, ideally with confirmation of neural integrity by stimulating the vagus if previously located. Bipolar cautery is used carefully to avoid nerve or parathyroid injury. It is not. Dissection proceeds by most surgeons do not place a drain. Interrupted sutures are placed through the stenohyoid muscle to prevent adhesion between the trachea and skin. The aim is not to perform a watertight closure of the muscle in case this promotes pressure in the event of a hematoma. The platysmal closure is followed by subcuticular skin closure with an absorbable suture. New technology in thyroidectomy. The major immediate risk following thyroidectomy is hemorrhage. Conventionally, artery forceps, ligatures and sutures have been used to secure the meticulous hemostasis necessary to minimize the risk of this potentially life-threatening complication. Ultrasonic shears, enhanced bipolar diathermy and harmonic vessel sealing devices are increasingly used in thyroid surgery and may be advantageous in complex procedures. Monitoring of the RLN and vagus nerve has become available over the last few years. By placing electrodes on the endotracheal tube between the vocal cords, movements can be detected when the nerve is stimulated. Such intermittent nerve monitoring is gaining in popularity. Advocates consider the monitor particularly useful in recurrent operations where scar tissue makes the nerve difficult to identify. In addition, some FND that operative time is reduced and that this is a valuable tool for training. There is also some support for the use of nerve monitoring during bilateral thyroid surgery, as the information provided can aid in the identification of a unilateral palsy to prevent bilateral palsy that can require tracheostomy. Those who do not support the use of the nerve monitor highlight the lack of evidence that there is any real difference in outcome associated with this practice. In addition, there is the expense of the base machine and the electrodes. In contrast to intermittent nerve monitoring that allows identification of a damaged nerve, continuous nerve monitoring has now been developed. In theory, this provides the opportunity to identify a nerve when function is threatened by excessive traction, for example. This technique, although theoretically advantageous, requires an electrode to be placed on the vagus nerve and has not gained widespread acceptance. Alternative surgical techniques. Over the past 2 decades, increasing experience has been gained in alternative approaches to thyroid surgery. Minimally invasive video-assisted techniques have been developed that allow surgeons to operate through an incision less than 2 cm in length. With appropriately modified dissectors, experienced operators and advanced hemostatic electrosurgical devices, such procedures offer reduced scar length. However, they are only appropriate for small volume disease and is such not suitable for many thyroid cases. Remote access thyroid surgery is of increasing interest. A number of approaches have been developed via axillary or breast incisions and also through the oral cavity. These approaches can be used with laparoscopic or robotic techniques to allow a magnified view of the operative site. Such maximally invasive techniques require extended dissection over the chest wall or neck and again are most suitable for small volume disease. Experienced centers continue to expand the indications for these techniques. However, they are associated with increased and significant time, which currently limits their application to most thyroid surgical practice. Postoperative complications. Hemorrhage is the most frequent life-threatening complication of thyroidectomy. Around 1 in 50 patients will develop a hematoma, and in almost all cases this will develop in the FRST 24 hours. If an arterial bleed occurs, the tension in the central compartment pressure can rise until it exceeds venous pressure. Venous edema of the larynx can then develop and cause airway obstruction, leading to death. Although improvements in understanding of the blood supply to the larynx and technical developments in terms of hemostatic technologies have been made, this complication has not been eliminated. Although many surgeons worldwide practice day case thyroidectomy, bleeding is the reason that, in the UK, thyroidectomy remains an inpatient procedure. Intraoperative attention to detail in terms of hemostasis is critical. When closing the wound, avoiding a watertight closure of the strap muscles may allow a hematoma to escape into the subcutaneous tissues. Wound drains have not been shown to have a protective effect. Close monitoring of the wound is advised postoperatively. If a hematoma develops, clinical staff should know to remove skin sutures in order to release some pressure and seek senior advice immediately. Endotracheal intubation should be used to secure the airway while the hematoma is evacuated and the bleeding point controlled. RLN paralysis in voice change. RLN injury may be. Figure 55.20 unilateral or bilateral, transient or permanent. Early routine postoperative laryngoscopy reveals a much higher incidence of transient cord paralysis than is detectable by simple assessment of the integrity of the voice and cough. Such temporary dysfunction is not clinically important, however, but voice and cord function should be assessed at FRST follow-up 4 weeks postoperatively. A British Association of Endocrine and Thyroid Surgeons audit revealed an RLN palsy rate of 1.8% at 1 month, declining to 0.5% at 3 months for FRST time operations. Permanent paralysis is rare if the nerve has been identified at operation. If an RLN is injured during surgery and the transected ends are identified, they should be reanastomosed. In the event that a length of nerve is excised, owing to invasion by malignancy, for example, anastomosis of the ansa cervicalis may be considered. This does not return mobility of the vocal cord but maintains neurological input to the muscles of the larynx. By avoiding denervation and related muscle atrophy, the vocal quality is improved. Permanent vocal cord paralysis should be treated conservatively with speech therapy. If voice quality is unacceptable, medialization procedures can be performed. Nerve grafting has shown promise but experience is limited. Injury to the external branch of the superior laryngeal nerve is more common because of its proximity to the superior thyroid artery. This leads to loss of tension in the vocal cord with diminished power and range in the voice. Patients, particularly those who use their voice professionally, must be advised that any thyroid operation will result in change to the voice even in the absence of nerve trauma. Fortunately, for most patients the changes are subtle and only demonstrable on formal voice assessment. Thyroid insufficiency. Thyroxine replacement will be required following total thyroidectomy. Around 1 in 3 patients who has a lobectomy will require supplementation. Rates are higher in those with thyroid autoantibodies. Subtotal thyroidectomy was at one time performed with the aim of leaving sufficient tissue to maintain thyroid function. However, this is difficult to judge and, over the years, the benign process that necessitated primary surgery may recur, requiring difficult revision procedures. For this reason, the practice of subtotal thyroidectomy has been more or less abandoned outside environments where exogenous parathyroid insufficiency. This is due to removal of the parathyroid glands or infarction through damage to the parathyroid end arteries. Often both factors occur together. Vascular injury is probably far more important than inadvertent removal. The incidence of permanent hypoparathyroidism should be less than 1% and most cases present dramatically 2 to 5 days after operation. Very rarely, the onset is delayed for 2 to 3 weeks or a patient with marked hypocalcemia may be asymptomatic. The complication is limited to total thyroidectomy, as when lobectomy is performed the contralateral parathyroid glands are sufficient to maintain calcium levels. In particular, total thyroidectomy with central neck dissection places the parathyroid glands and their vascular supply at great risk and should only be performed when there is evidence of metastatic disease or high risk of occult disease in the regional lymph nodes. Thyrotoxic crisis, storm. This is an acute exacerbation of hypothyroidism. It occurs if a thyrotoxic patient has been inadequately prepared for thyroidectomy and is now extremely rare. Very rarely, a thyrotoxic patient presents in a crisis and this may follow an unrelated operation. Symptomatic and supportive treatment is for dehydration, hyperpyrexia and restlessness. This requires the administration of intravenous fluids, cooling the patient with ice packs, administration of oxygen, diuretics for cardiac failure, digoxin for uncontrolled atrial fibrillation, sedation and intravenous hydrocortisone. Specific treatment is bicarbimazole 10 to 20 mg 6 hourly, Lugol's iodine 10 drops 8 hourly by mouth or sodium iodide 1 gram intravenously. Propanolol intravenously 1 to 2 mg or orally 40 grams 6 hourly will block beta-adrenergic effects. Wound infection. Cellulitis requiring prescription of antibiotics, often by the general practitioner, is more common than most surgeons appreciate. A significant subcutaneous or deep cervical abscess is exceptionally rare and should be drained. Hypertrophic or keloid scar. This is more likely to form if the incision overlays the sternum and in dark-skinned individuals. Intradermal injections of corticosteroid should be given at once and repeated monthly if necessary. Scar revision rarely results in significant long-term improvement. Stitch granuloma. This may occur with or without sinus formation and is seen after the use of non-absorbable, particularly silk, suture material. Absorbable ligatures and sutures should be used throughout thyroid surgery. Postoperative care following surgery. The patient should be returned to the recovery room and nursed overnight on the ward. Wound care should include vigilance for signs of a hematoma. Following total thyroidectomy, calcium levels should be checked postoperatively. Not all patients develop immediate hypocalcemia and they should be educated about the signs, paresthesia of the phalanges and toes or around the mouth. Serial calcium monitoring should be recommended for those at highest risk. Those patients who had a total thyroidectomy require thyroxine replacement, which should start on day 1 postoperatively. On clinic review, in addition to checking the histology report, the wound should be inspected and the larynx examined for vocal cord function. Biochemical assessment of thyroid function and calcium, if required, should be arranged.